Good morning, everyone, and let me express my apologies for being late. But by way of explanation, I make it a practice before the meetings to visit with former colleagues on the floor. And when I told them what our subject was today, I couldn't get away. This is clearly an issue that is of great significance and high priority, and members have a variety of thoughts about what needs to be done. And it's interesting, and I think we'll see this as we get into the substance of our hearing. A great deal of what they are talking to me about is directly related to local rules and local planning. It's not even statewide policy. It is the consequences of decisions that have been made at the city or local or the county level that impact the way housing is built, the number of housing, and different elements that go into it. So I apologize for being late. As you can tell probably from the little card in front of me, my name is Pedro Nava. I'm the chair of the Little Hoover Commission. Let me introduce other commissioners who are here. To my right is Vice Chairman Varner, Commissioners Sidley, Commissioners Emerson, and Aaroner. To my left are Commissioners Beyer and Schramberger. Good to see all of you. Thank you. Also today, our commission staff. To my immediate left is Ethan Rarick, and on the far left at that end is Deputy Executive Director Tamar Foster. And congratulations are in order for Ms. Foster. She is a Deputy Executive Director. She has been with the Commission a number of years, and we're very, very pleased that she applied for the position. And I know from information provided to me it was a competitive seat, and congratulations, well deserved. In the audience are Administrative Analyst Sherry McAllister, and our newest staff member, Research Analyst Rachel Mattioli. Did I say that right? Close enough, thank you. Now, Ms. Mattioli comes to us. Give me a second.
She's a bear.
Is there a new one?
Berkeley.
Why don't you go ahead?
Yes, I can do that, Mr. Chairman. Rachel graduated from UC Berkeley earlier this year, has been working in the State Department of Education in their policy office since she graduated, and previously while she was at school had internships in the governor's office, in the state senate, and was a student assistant for the California Department of Justice.
Welcome and thank you very much. Let's do some housekeeping. This hearing on housing costs will conclude shortly before noon. Then the Commission will reconvene in room 125 in this building for a business meeting. That meeting is open to the public, and you're all welcome to join us, unless you've got a better offer for lunch somewhere. We're live streaming the hearing today via the Assembly website. After the hearing, we'll place a permanent link on the video recording on our Commission website. After the testimony this morning, we'll receive public comment. If you'd like to comment, please provide a comment slip to Rachel or Sherry. They can be found on the desk, and we respectfully ask that your public comments be limited to 3 minutes. Now let's turn to the topic of today's hearing, the factors that are driving the high cost of housing in California. A few topics have received more attention in this building and elsewhere than the cost of housing in our state. It's long been more expensive to live here than in most other parts of the country, but beginning in the 80s, the divergence between the state and the nation became much larger. Today, the median cost of a single-family home in California is approximately 2.5 times the national median. The result is that California has one of the nation's lowest home ownership rates. Californians spend a disproportionate share of their income on housing, and the share of crowded housing units has increased. Voters consistently cite housing costs as one of the key issues facing the state. Today, we begin to examine this issue. First, by seeking to identify the underlying factors that have driven up the cost of California housing so dramatically. We will initially hear from experts from two of our state's leading universities. Professor Stuart A. Gabriel, a professor of finance and Arden Realty chair at the Anderson School of Management at UCLA. Any shout-outs for UCLA?
Yes.
There you go.
Baby bears.
And David Garcia, policy director at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation at the University of California at Berkeley. Is anybody, there you go. After that, we'll hear from three stakeholders in this area. Mr. Dan Dunmoyer of the California Building Industry Association and two representatives of California's local governments. Sean McGlynn, the city manager of Santa Rosa, representing the California League of Cities, and Christopher A. Lee, legislative representative for housing, land use, and transportation with the California State Association of Counties. I want to thank all of the witnesses for taking the time to share their knowledge with us as we begin to examine this complicated issue. Few topics are of greater importance to the long-term future of our state. And if the executive director would be so kind as to call the first witnesses.
Mr. Chairman, we'll ask Dr. Gabriel and Mr. Garcia to come up and take their seats, and they are each going to provide brief testimony, and then after that, we will, the commission can have questions for them. So we'll begin with Dr. Gabriel.
Welcome and thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Certainly pleased to be here, certainly pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you about what I believe is probably the primary domestic policy issue facing the state of California, that being issues that relate to our housing supply and our house prices and all the rest. I did have the opportunity to unknowingly ride up the elevator with a couple of your members, so I shared a few conclusions already, but and I also had the opportunity yesterday, Ethan, to pass along some written notes, so hopefully some of you have seen the content of what I'm going to speak about today. Certainly welcome any of your questions. So let me begin, and I'm going to say a few words that kind of just set the stage, and then I'll go on from there into some more specific remarks. The first dimension of setting the stage is to just look at the recent severe cyclical variability in housing markets in the state of California. House prices during the financial crisis falling on order of magnitude of 40% in the state, quality adjusted, coming back since that time. So if you look at major coastal areas of the state today, house prices are roughly 10 to 30% above their pre-2007 peak. What that means is that we have severe affordability problems as incomes have not moved up in any way commensurate with the rise in house prices. And to just give you a data point there, on order of magnitude of 1/5 of homeowners and on order of magnitude of 1/3 of renters face what we call severe affordability burdens. And what that means is that they pay more than 50% of their income on housing. Now, just to go back to my discipline, the discipline of economics, and talk a little bit about supply and demand, let me reference a couple of those factors. If you look to housing supply in the state, typically via building permits for single and multifamily dwellings, those permits in recent years have averaged basically 110,000 units a year. That's more or less the last 4 years. If you look to the years 2008 through 2014, basically the recession years and recovery from the recession, permits were running about 50,000 units a year on average. Now, in the mid-1980s, permits were running 300,000 units per year on average. So what you see there is relative to population growth, and I'll get to population growth momentarily, we've accrued a major deficit as relates to supply of new housing. If you look at the state's population, the primary demand side factor related to housing, the population of the state of California has roughly doubled in the last 40 years. So in 1980, the population of the state was 23 million. Population of the state today is 40 million. So you can dig into the dimensions of population state change in the state. You can look to the fact that we have some lower income and lower educated households that are leaving the state. You can look to the fact that millennial tech workers are entering the state. We still have strong international immigration into the state. But what this all adds up to basically, as you've already surmised, is we have a very serious and significant supply and demand imbalance. Since 2005, we're producing roughly 30 housing units for every 100 new residents. Our governor, Governor Newsom, has called for what he describes as a California Marshall Plan. And he's enumerated that by suggesting that we have a goal of producing roughly 3.5 million new homes in the next 5 years between now and 2025. If you look to a highly reputable independent economic forecasting unit in the state, the UCLA Anderson Forecast, and it's an academic forecast, so it's not biased by any particular dimension of business development. The forecast calls for about 125,000 new housing units to be produced each year for the next couple of years. So there's a huge chasm between what we're forecasting to produce and what the governor wants to see produced. And even in the best case scenario, given the forecast, we're going to produce about 20% of the governor's goals. Clearly, the implications of that supply-demand imbalance are evident. They're evident in the rise in house prices that Mr. Nava has cited. They're evident in affordability constraints. And that's the reason we're here. Okay, that's kind of background point number one. Here's background point number two. If you take the value of a home, think of the value of the home as the sum of two components, the value of the land and the value of the improvements. Another way of thinking of the value of a home, or the cost of producing a home, is to think about the three primary inputs to production: land, labor, and capital. Labor and capital are basically embodied in the cost of improvements. And why am I going through this? I'm going through this because if you want one factor that is salient to the rise in housing costs in the state of California over time, it's the rise in land costs. That is the component that is of concern. The other thing to note from economics perspective is that land capitalizes in its value or reflects the value of location-specific amenities. So anything about the local environment, be it access to jobs or quality of schools or air quality or crime rates, any local amenity is capitalized into the value of land. And what that means is not only that identical houses can be very differentially priced depending on location. And to just give you a Southern California example, an identical home in Santa Monica can be 6 or 8 times that home in San Bernardino. And it's not because the improvements differ in cost, it's because the land values are so different. Now, the value of amenities capitalized into land along the coast are always going to be elevated relative to the interior. There's always going to be a price differential between the coast and the interior. That price differential has only widened over time. And I should say that one of the things that we can do as economists is statistically to extract the value of particular amenities from aggregate land values. So if you give me data, I can tell you how much a good public school is worth or how much good air quality is worth based on the extraction of what consumers are willing to pay for those amenities. So those are two background points. And with those background points in, I'm going to just launch into a couple of dimensions of rising housing cost. The first dimension that I'd like to mention relates to land costs. Actually, 2 out of 3 dimensions relate to land costs. And this dimension is called local government land use regulatory constraint. That's where I'd like to put some emphasis. This is not a new story in California. It's easily a 50-year-old story. And it has to do with use by local government of what we call fiscal and exclusionary zoning tools to delineate and constrain the type, the pace, and the magnitude of development within their jurisdictions. Fiscal zoning typical zoning is for the purpose of separating noxious land uses from uses that are non-noxious. So the major petroleum installations in the South Bay of LA, you'd want to separate those from residential neighborhoods. That's the purpose of typical zoning. But in fiscal zoning, jurisdictions look at the fiscal impact or the cost revenue impact of development. So you're going to look at a residential development and you're going to ask the question, what's the discounted value of the revenue flows, typically the property tax revenue flows associated with this development, relative to what am I going to pay for streets, for sewers, for infrastructure, for police, for fire? And in any case where that fiscal impact is negative, jurisdictions have a very long and significant track record of minimizing or allocation of land to those uses, or in some cases, one case pertinent to this commission is affordable housing. Because affordable housing is denser, it comes with different populations, sometimes more utilization of local public services, that affordable housing is going to have a negative fiscal impact, and you're just not going to see it. So that's kind of what we call fiscal zoning. And then exclusionary zoning has a precedent as well. And exclusionary zoning kind of ups the ante here, and it talks about efforts to exclude households that might be low income, and because they might be low income, they might require more services, or they might be less welcome in enclaves that are typically homogeneous with respect to socioeconomic character and the like. So, for example, in the San Francisco Bay Area, you have 90 separate tax and spending local jurisdictions. And many of these jurisdictions are quite homogeneous in socioeconomic character, and that is perhaps indirectly a reflection of exclusionary zoning. I should say parenthetically that historically, fortunately not today, and certainly illegal, there's been a racial context to exclusionary zoning as well. And you can go back to the books of cities like Pasadena in the 1960s and see explicit reference to racial covenants. In any case, the point that I'm trying to make here is that this fiscal zoning got expressly embodied some 40, 50 years ago into growth management practices on the part of local governments. And the poster child there is the city of Petaluma. And I'm taking you, since I have a lot of gray hair and all the rest, I'm going to take you back to 1972, when the city of Petaluma passed the first voter-approved growth management plan in the United States. And what they did in that plan is they halved allocation of development to new single-family homes. They basically halved their allocation. And this was contested in the courts. It was contested by the building industry and the California Supreme Court in 1976 in really what was described as a path-breaking and landmark decision, basically declined to review an appellate court decision, which basically upheld the right of local jurisdictions to allocate land as they see fit in accordance with any dimension of growth management. And this set into place a situation where Petaluma now has become storied in the literature. Generations of students have studied it. And it set into place a mechanism where jurisdiction after jurisdiction in the state of California enacted some form of growth management based on fiscal impact of development. So anyway, in other words, everyone's looking for what's right for the city of Beverly Hills. No one's looking for what's right for the LA metro area. Okay, so that having been said, this growth management obviously has been a highly deterministic, very important factor in constraining supply of land for development. We know that on average, land costs comprise something like a quarter of the costs of developing a new home in the state, but that 1/4 value varies markedly across areas. And again, just to provide you with an empirical example, in Santa Monica, those land costs may be 6 or 8 times what they are in San Bernardino. So to summarize, a first salient factor associated with rising housing costs in the state of California has been 50 years of local government supply constraint on development.
And just let me suggest, and
Am I being too long-winded?
No, what I was just going to tell you is when you get interrupted, you should feel complimented.
Oh, okay.
I mean, that's basically how it works here. We have,
No worries. I teach for a living. Just
Okay,
tell me
okay,
what to do.
right.
You ask questions.
well, what strikes me is, and there is this difficult political balance between local control and an objective such as the governor proposes. And I still remember when I was bushwhacked at a meeting. I was the chair of emergency services and had a homeowners group called me and wanted to have a briefing on emergency services. I was representing Santa Barbara at the time. So I got there, and like a good little assembly member, I made my pitch. And the first question I was asked was, would I introduce legislation to do away with RENA, the housing mandates? So it wasn't about emergency services. It was about housing. And my answer to that was no, and I gave reasons why. And I was basically speaking to a group that didn't like me anyway, so I didn't really lose any votes. But for electeds on city councils and board of supervisors, their contributions come from members of the community and significantly from different interests, that particular development interest. And I don't want to single them out, but I'm just suggesting that unless and until there's a means by which what happened in Petaluma can be addressed, local land use decisions will continue to drive the problem that we have. I also sat on the Wildfire Commission. And so when local government makes decisions about permitting homes in areas of high wildfire risk, that contributes to all of the other sorts of issues that we have to deal with. So I just wanted to sort of drop that thing in the punch bowl while we're having a conversation. And Commissioner Byer?
I know you're shocked. So I want to go in a slightly different direction. I think we're going to come back to the local state authority matter. One of the challenges we have throughout today is what you started with, which is the gap between the reality of 20% more housing in the next 5 years and the governor's goal. And as much as each of us wants to have a silver bullet or a sling of silver bullets, they don't exist, and they're all complicated. So can you help us think about the experience from outside California, where states or other countries have been successful in getting to scale? In other words, take us out of the California-specific land use planning, Board of Supervisors stuff, and say, okay, what can we learn from Seattle, Minneapolis, Singapore, Germany? I mean, there is a housing shortage all over the world in multiple different dimensions, and there are a variety of tools that have been applied. And what I worry about in our study here today is that we end up focusing so much on California, we might miss opportunities for new ideas that haven't been tried here before that could go into this 80% gap.
Yes, well, David, you said it absolutely correctly in the sense that it's not one particular tool, but it's a sling of tools that may aggregate up. And I'm going to mention some of those later on. I'm going to mention some principles that might be related to some of those approaches later on, and I'm sure that my colleagues and others testifying will do the same. Bearing in mind a couple of things. One, when we talk about local government land use regulatory constraint on development, we're talking about the supply side. The question is what's going on the demand side. These regulatory constraints don't mean anything if there isn't adequate and excess demand for those particular locations. So there are many, many places that may wish to constrain supply that simply can't or don't because it really doesn't matter. One of the things I'm going to talk about in a little while, and maybe I'll get a little further and then I'll come back to it, is thinking about how to move production of housing in California to areas where land costs are lower. Those areas have lower land costs for lots of reasons. One reason being inadequacy of demand for those sites. And if we can open up those sites, there's a potentiality for scalable private sector work. But if you don't mind, David, if it's okay with you, can I come back to this in like 2 or 3 minutes? Sure. Yeah, and please press me if I don't. I'm happy to. Okay. Let me get to a second, what I believe is salient factor related to high and rising housing costs in California. And there I'm going to take you back to 1978. I'm going to take you back to the state property tax limitation called Proposition 13. For those of you who were alive and around and thinking about stuff in 1978, and I mean that graciously and with all due respect.
Don't worry.
What? No, I'm mostly referring to myself, and I'll get to that momentarily.
All of us were there.
Okay. What you recall is that what this limitation did was to halve, on average, property tax rates in the state. So property tax rates went from an average rate of 2% of market value to 1% of market value. The whole deal there was that property taxes at the time, local property taxes, comprised the primary local revenue tool. So that what proponents of the initiative failed to consider in their very enthusiastic support of this initiative was that local government would respond to this halving in local government, halving of revenues. And in fact, local government did respond. Turns out, again, in reference to some of my gray hair, that I was a young and aspiring PhD student at Berkeley at the time. And I make reference in my written testimony here to a working paper that I wrote 40 years ago. At that time, I went out with a colleague who was recently the dean of the School of City and Regional Planning at Berkeley, Jennifer Walsh, and we surveyed the 90 independent jurisdictions in the state of California as to their reaction to Prop 13, to this halving in local government revenues associated with property taxes. Here are the 3 things that they did. This comes out of our report. Firstly, they increased application of growth management tools to reduce, deny, or delay development of those real estate asset classes, including affordable housing, with negative fiscal impact. That was the first dimension of survey results. The second, they imposed elevated fees and exactions on new development, where an exaction would be to ask a developer, while you're at it, to put in a park or put in a school or put in some roads or other infrastructure, whatever. So local government imposed on developers elevated fees and exactions on new construction to help recoup the lost property tax revenues. And the third thing that we found in our survey research, and has been very graphically evidenced since that time, is local governments engaged in competition with one another to attract retail development, where that retail development brought with it sales tax revenues that, in fact, replaced some of the property tax revenues. So in my neck of the woods, we have 2 jurisdictions side by side, Oxnard and Ventura. They both have major car malls. They both have major outlet malls. You say to yourself, why do I have 2 outlet malls within 3 miles of one another? And the answer is they're both trying to attract sales tax revenue. So in the 40 years that have intervened, these elevated development fees and exactions have become an important local government revenue source. So I'm going to give you an example now. It's a current example, and it's an example from the Sacramento area. So you take a newly constructed $400,000 home in a suburb of Sacramento, maybe Elk Grove, something like that. That home sells for $400,000, and of that $400,000, $80,000 or 20% are development fees and exactions. And if you get closer to the Bay Area, or if you get closer to LA, you can see even a doubling of those development fees and exactions, so that it could be $160,000 in San Jose. Now, David, you asked about some other places in Austin or Las Vegas or Phoenix. $12,000, not $80,000, not $160,000 in impact fees. And as you've, of course, already surmised, these impact fees add substantially to the price of a new California home. They markedly reduce affordability. And when you think about Prop 13, there were a lot of different impacts. Development fees and exactions became disconnected to the actual cost of development. They became way in excess. Development fees and exactions were a way of local governments shifting costs from existing residents to newcomers. Development fees and exactions created tax inequities that I'm going to talk about momentarily. Prop 13 reduced mobility amongst longstanding homeowners, and this is factor number 2 in increasing the cost of housing. You can see right here in Sacramento, $80,000 on 400K. Yes.
I think we're at 10 minutes after 10, and I think that you're at a point, that's okay. I think you're at a point here where what Mr. Garcia has will dovetail nicely with what you have, and then allow commissioners the opportunity to sort of flesh some things out.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
Not at all. No. Believe me, you've got the commissioner's attention, so you've been successful at what you're doing. But I just want to make sure that Mr. Garcia has an opportunity to add to what you've already provided us.
Okay, would you like me to wrap up quickly? Or
Okay. Yeah,
okay.
Please.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, so you kind of got my point. My point is 3/4 of the price of a home could be associated with these constraints, these fees, et cetera. I want to say, I'm going to skip some of what I want to say and just focus on maybe 2 other points before I conclude. Here's point number 1. I've alluded to this very marked spatial variation of land costs between coast and interior. And here we have an opportunity to think about how to scale affordable housing development. You're not going to scale affordable housing development along the coast. You're not going to do it in Santa Monica. You're not going to do it in San Francisco. It simply won't happen. The private sector won't participate because it's simply impossible for the private sector to put low-cost affordable housing on very expensive land. The economics simply don't work. So the way that affordable housing gets built in Santa Monica, and I train people to do it all the time in a program that I run at UCLA, is it gets done through low-income housing tax credits. And what I describe it as a teacup into the Santa Monica Bay. It's symbolic, it's a success, but it's not material. It's not going to solve any problems. The way to solve problems is to get to low-cost land areas. So my little pitch, so to speak, to all of you is to think about transportation infrastructure investment as affordable housing policy. For example, if we had a rapid train to Palmdale and Lancaster, we could unlock very low-cost land and get people to and from jobs, et cetera. So, okay, that's one point.
Professor,
Done?
could I ask you a question on that?
Sure.
Because I live in the Inland Empire,
Yes.
and so when I came here this morning, I got up at
3.
very early, and when I got on the freeway, there was traffic.
Yes.
And back wall-to-wall traffic in one stretch, and they're all going out to Orange County and LA for work.
Right.
So we have the low-cost land in the Inland Empire. What we don't have in the Inland Empire is the jobs, and so you talk about the transportation infrastructure. I'd like to think about it more from the perspective of bring the jobs to where the people can live, and I know that's part of what some of the discussions about urbanization, bringing the low-cost housing to urbanization. I think what you're advocating right now is that's probably not realistic, and that we need to provide a mobilization of the workforce to the urban areas. And I'd like to, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but I'd like to think of it as, why can't we encourage jobs to come to those areas where the low-cost land is?
I 1,000% agree. I simply didn't get to that point. And the transportation infrastructure and connectivity between the places will do both. It'll allow for job creation in low-cost areas. Even just simply population of lower cost areas will bring with it a whole myriad of retail and population surveying jobs just right there, and other jobs will follow. Part of that has to do with the creation of amenities in those interior areas that are similar to amenities in the coast that will help with desirability and all the rest.
And I agree with that, but it's almost like what do you build first? So do you build the amenities first, or do you get? It's a difficult question. We have that question out in the Inland Empire all the time with regard to education, with regard to entertainment,
Yeah.
and then having the jobs there. I mean, I think the last study I saw was about 500,000 residents of Inland Empire are on the freeways going to other jurisdictions for their jobs every day.
Right, right. Well, we've got to be really smart about transportation, and there's a whole myriad of things that we can do, but that transportation access will unlock many of these interior areas and make it economic for the private sector on a scalable basis to develop what we might call affordable housing. Let me conclude by just saying two things. Consequences of lack of affordability, and I think that there's broad consensus here. I wrote a paper, I don't know if I cited it here, where I talked about consequences of lack of affordability. You can talk about those consequences on two levels, the level of the individual household and the level of the metropolitan area. On the level of the individual household, we see correlations between lack of affordability and, as has been referenced here already today, residential overcrowding, longer commutes, reduced spending on goods and services, including pharmaceuticals, healthcare, well-being, education, et cetera. So there's a whole set of deleterious household level outcomes that relate to lack of affordability. But there's also metro area outcomes. Why should Eric Garcetti care about lack of affordable housing? Well, lack of affordable housing means outmigration of households and firms. Why should a firm come to LA relative to Ontario when you can't afford to house any of your employees in LA? Right. It means limitations on job growth, reductions in metropolitan economic base and activity, and dare I mention, substantially higher levels of homelessness. So these rising housing costs imperil both households. They substantially adversely affect California job creation and economic competitiveness. That's another reason why we're all here today. So in closing, I thank you for the opportunity to speak here today, and I thank you and applaud your efforts as relate to the creation of California housing.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Mr. Garcia.
And Mr. Chairman, Sherry's going to bring up, Mr. Garcia has a PowerPoint, so.
Great. Perfect.
And the commissioners also have printed copies of the PowerPoint. Unfortunately, it's due to our fault, those are not printed in color, so you may want to check the slides as well. So.
Perfect. All right. Well, good morning, members of the Commission. Thank you for having me this morning. Again, my name is David Garcia. I'm the Policy Director at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation. So I work at Berkeley, went to UCLA, so I have coverage for all areas of the state. Sure.
I went to Berkeley and work at UCLA.
There you go. We have it all covered. Professor Gabriel covered a lot of what I'm going to cover, so I'm not going to spend too much time kind of... Perfect. So then my remarks will be relatively short because I actually think it'll be more constructive to talk about potential solutions. I think we all understand that there's a serious housing problem here in California, and you have all of these in your notes as well. You can refer to it any time, but I don't need to reiterate this, but essentially, to the extent that owning a home is the American dream and the pathway to building equity and wealth, that's hard to do in California. Only 29% of Californians can afford a median price home, lowest level since the 1940s. If you're a renter, it's even worse. As Professor Gabriel mentioned, we have millions of renters who are considered rent burdened, and as a result, that last point is actually an undercount. It should be 150,000 homeless individuals in the state of California, which accounts for a quarter of the homeless population in the United States. For context, California as a state accounts for 12% of the total population. So there's definitely an outsized burden on California with that issue. And part of the consequences of this, outside of more and more families and individuals being pushed into homelessness, is that people are leaving the state. This chart you see here is from the Legislative Analyst's Office, and it shows you the net in and out migration of different income groups, and you can see all the way up to about $100,000 annually. We have people leaving the state, and they're leaving for places like Texas, Oregon, Nevada, and Arizona. So to reiterate a point made earlier, we are simply not building enough housing that that is needed to keep up with demand. Again, the State Department of Housing and Community Development says we need about 180,000 units per year to keep up with demand. And again, we're only building about 100,000 per year. And if you look at what we built historically, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, we routinely built greater than 200,000 units per year. So this is not as if the state has not seen this level of home building before. Simply, we do not see that today. I'll also point out we used to have a greater mix of units. So in the blue, you see single-family homes. In the green, you see multifamily. Decades ago, we built a pretty good balance of the two. And in our most recent boom, from the 90s to the 2000s, we were building mostly single-family homes and mostly in suburban and exurban places. So we know the problem boils down to we're not building enough homes across income levels. And then the question becomes why? Why are we not building enough homes? And so I'll really touch on these next points very quickly here. But one of the issues has to do with our land use practices. To Professor Gabriel's point, our exclusionary land use practices. This is a chart of the Bay Area. And what it's basically showing you is where you see red is more high density housing in urban cores and commercial corridors. And then you also see areas of light blue, which represent single-family home building in mostly suburban and exurban places. But the chart is dominated by dark blue, which signifies areas that are zoned for residential but have seen no home building in at least the last 20 years. So we've somewhat artificially constrained where we actually have land to build, which has the impact of driving up land prices and raising the cost of construction overall. And to that point, it is expensive to build in California. This is an analysis by the Government Accountability Office that compares the cost to build affordable housing units across with different states. And so you can see California on the far right is a pretty big outlier. It costs about twice as much to build one unit of affordable housing here in California as it does in places like Texas, Georgia, and in Ohio. And you can see broken out into categories. One of the big drivers is land, as well as other soft costs, which include things like impact fees and whatnot, which is another point we touched on earlier. And certainly the rising cost of construction is not unique to California. This is something we're seeing nationwide. And part of this is natural. It can be driven by, say, the growth of economies overseas, raising the demand for things like steel, lumber, concrete. It can be from tariffs, but it can also be from decisions we make locally and as a state. So, for example, California has very high environmental building code standards, structural building code standards, and there are good reasons for this. We have environmental goals. We also live with earthquakes, and so we need our buildings to be strong. At the same time, this does make housing more expensive in California. But again, these are for generally good policy goals. But there are some other local constraints that raise costs as well. Going back to the issue of impact fees, we did a comprehensive report on impact fees last year throughout the state of California, and we found that some jurisdictions actually charge upwards of $150,000 per unit in impact fees, which certainly raises the cost there. And it's not just that costs have been rising. Construction as a whole has not seen very much growth in productivity. On the right-hand side, you see a chart from McKinsey that shows the growth in productivity in construction versus the growth in productivity for manufacturing. As you can see, we basically have been doing the same thing for construction for 100 years, whereas manufacturing and other industries have been becoming more productive.
You have some commissioners that have questions.
Yes.
Sure.
So on the productivity question, and most of the time people say, well, the only area of the economy that hasn't improved productivity is healthcare. So it's good to see that there's somebody with healthcare in the same problem. What are the 3-4 major impediments to productivity improvement? And particularly the buzz around modular housing that's pre-constructed and then put together, new building materials, the whole array of possible productivity enhancements. And are there levers, local, state, federal, that can influence that? And the more specific you can get, the better.
Sure. That's a really good question, and it's a topic that we've looked at a lot at the Terner Center, is the potential for things like modular or panelized construction to bring down costs and increase productivity. I think one of the challenges is that, construction is very site-specific. And so we have been building housing very specific to the sites. And so that doesn't really lend itself very well to doing something in a streamlined fashion. So it's not as if we can create cars coming off the assembly line, or we haven't done that. To that point, though, there are a number of new business endeavors to try and turn that kind of factory model into something that can work for housing. And the analysis we've done preliminarily shows that by doing housing in a modular fashion, we have the potential to lower costs by 20% and to increase the time savings by 40% by doing so. There's a number of projects that are being built today or that have been built recently using modular construction that have shown some promise. I think it's still in its infancy, in its early stages, and so there's some unexpected cost or time challenges that they're running into. But in the long term, I think there's tremendous potential to kind of change the way we approach building our homes to see that kind of saving in costs and saving in time. But as far as barriers, it's really just a lot of the same barriers that any new technology or new industry is going to face is just growing pains, really.
So to get specific, so if you were a local jurisdiction and you wanted to create an incentive, you could say, we're going to fast track permitting if you're using modular housing. We're going to offer a tax break on the fees that the professor talked about. I mean, aren't there things that could be done at a governmental level that would encourage,
Sure.
To use the behavioral economic term, nudge, those kind of productivity changes, either as an experiment or as a cost reduction that's linked to increased affordability, climate change benefits, et cetera?
I think that's a fair point, and one I would say doesn't necessarily need to be limited to, say, using modular construction. I mean, there should be a case made for extending those kind of benefits for all housing to the extent that we need housing. And some cities have done that, not for modular housing to my knowledge, but they have lowered impact fees. They have increased the speed at which they entitle projects for, say, deed-restricted affordable housing or housing that meets other goals. I haven't seen that for modular housing, but I think one of the challenges is the decision to use modular housing is on the developer, and a lot of times there's not that many places that make modular housing units, and so there's a bit of a pipeline issue there. So if you wanted to incent the usage of modular housing, you could do that, but again, that's really incumbent on the developer to go down that path. So I would say we should broaden our scope of what should qualify for these local incentives to things like affordable housing or maybe missing middle housing types, things like townhomes, duplexes, things that are more naturally affordable, in addition to using technologies like modular or panelized construction.
Commissioner Erner?
Yeah, so I'm interested in the relationship, if there's a relationship between Prop 13 and developer fees and the increase in developer fees, because you're talking about things like schools, and roads and things like that, normally government pays for.
Right.
And so has anybody looked at that? I mean, pre-1978, were developer fees an issue?
So that's an excellent question, and part of our research we've examined the link between Proposition 13 and the increase in impact fees, and you make an excellent point. A lot of cities, they have very real things they need to pay for. They need to pay for their infrastructure, schools need funding, but Proposition 13 really kind of tied the hands of local governments for raising revenues in other ways. And so impact fees presented kind of a politically easy way to raise revenues to pay for these very important things. The problem we run into, as Professor Gabriel mentioned, is that this, in effect, kind of puts a tax on new residents because it does raise the cost of housing. So I think
But so does Prop 13.
Prop 13 does as well. And I think one of the issues we run into is we've also lost sight of the fact that the federal government used to be very involved in creating and maintaining local infrastructure. And with the retrenchment of the federal government and with the restraints on property tax revenue by Prop 13, cities don't have very many options to pay for things that they do need.
Commissioner Sidley?
I really have what I think is a minor point, but I'm looking at my neighborhood. My neighborhood, all I see is the houses go down and then a new house comes up. So I'm wondering, is this an undercount too? I mean, because someone's pulling a permit to build a house, but they're not getting new housing. They're getting the same house, only bigger. And so I'm just wondering, as we do all this study, are we actually undercounting the problem if we're counting the number of permits built? There are no new homes in my neighborhood, although there are a lot of new homes. So I was just wondering how that works.
That's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head if the data source accounts for whether or not a tear down and replacement of a home would count as a new unit in the data. I have heard anecdotally that is kind of an experience of a lot of folks that are seeing homes that are relatively modest being torn down for larger homes. And it kind of begs the question, if we are allowing that form of development to happen, why would you not allow a bigger home to house, say, 2 units or one larger unit and a unit in the backyard of that lot? So I think there's definitely something to be said about how our land use practices are pushing people to build larger homes, but they're not allowed to build simply more units.
Commissioner Varner?
So can you clarify for me in the analysis on Prop 13, how much are you factoring into CFDs, Mello-Roos, and like in my neighborhood, there's a special fire district?
Yeah, so in our analysis, we tried to look at all of the various fees that a development project would encounter. So that includes things like special districts, it includes school fees. We weren't able to get utility fees, which my understanding that is actually a pretty significant percentage of the overall amount of fees. But we tried to look at all of those different fees because cities don't actually control all of the fees. Right. And in some cases, their stack of fees may only take up a fraction of the overall cost that a developer will encounter from fees from other entities. So that's an important point.
But are those fees, the CFDs and the Mello-Roos, are they a replacement for the property tax?
They can be. It depends what they are put in place for. So a Mello-Roos can be put in place for paying for different facilities that otherwise may only be able to be paid for through a special tax.
So I have a question. Maybe you touched upon it. With respect to the fees, is there any requirement that the fees be related to the cost of providing the service?
That's a really great question. So state law requires cities to conduct what is known as a nexus study to substantiate any of their fees that they charge. And what the nexus study requires is that a city, if they want to charge an impact fee, they have to find that there's some relationship between the fee they are charging and the development itself. Now, there is some question as to how rigorous these analyses are because the state law is actually quite broad. And so you may have a city that commissions a nexus study from a consultant, and the consultant says you can legally charge up to $100,000 per unit for a fire fee. We've established that nexus, and the city can choose any number below $100,000 per unit as their fee. So yes, there is a requirement. There is some question as to whether or not that requirement is overly broad.
So do you know whether or not there's a mechanism for a resident or anybody to examine or challenge the legitimacy of the nexus? I mean, do you have to go to court to do that?
So I believe this is actually probably something one of our next speakers will be able to speak to from the BIA, but I believe there are mechanisms to challenge the validity of a nexus study or a fee in general. It would be difficult for say, a developer to do that because even if you take a city to court and they invalidate their fee or make it lower, you still have to do business in that city and they still have to approve your project. So it becomes a bit of a delicate situation.
Yeah, your permits get lost.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So the very last point I want to make is specific to affordable housing. As you all know, affordable housing, which is deed restricted, oftentimes paid for with low-income housing tax credits, it does require a significant amount of subsidy to create. And to the extent that we have a dearth of affordable housing, the state of California doesn't have enough money to really subsidize all of the affordable housing that is needed. So this is just a quick chart. It's actually a bit outdated, but we have about $5 billion annually, which seems like a lot. But analysis has shown that we actually need $15 billion annually if we were to build the number of subsidized units that we need to meet demand. So I'm going to stop there. I want to thank the Commission again for having us in this very important topic. Obviously, this is an incredible challenge. I will say I've been somewhat encouraged by these steps the legislature has taken in a number of years. We've strengthened Housing Accountability Act. We've done a number of other things to try and hold cities more accountable. We've had some really good success stories with accessory dwelling unit legislation. So certainly more to be done, but it's very good to see that the legislature has taken this this very, very difficult challenge seriously in the last few years.
Yeah, and I know that there are time constraints, but I live in Santa Barbara, and they have the accessory dwelling unit, but it was so cumbersome, people just didn't even bother. But because of what has happened in Sacramento, they've changed the way that they go about doing that, and we're seeing more of those being built in the neighborhoods. But that is that delicate balance between local control and the state mandating certain kinds of action to be taken, and the political consequences to those that who are elected that choose to make that an issue that they want to pursue.
Yeah, and so to the extent I think that the states can provide cover for those elected officials by saying, hey, look, ADUs, they are approved ministerially. That is out of those elected officials' hands, and so they don't necessarily have to be held accountable for each of those small decisions.
Right. And before I let you go, do either of you have, and maybe we'll hear this from the next panel, the likelihood or the success in the past of initiative or driven requirements that voters put on the ballot to change some of the decision-making with respect to land use?
So one thing that's been relatively successful and something we profiled, and I'm sure something Professor Gabriel can touch on too, has been the Transit-Oriented Communities Program in Los Angeles, which was initiated by the voters with Measure JJJ in 2016, which provided some streamlined approvals for projects that adhered to some standards and included affordable housing. That has led to thousands of new applications of units there. That's been one example of a voter-driven initiative to do that.
Can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
Going back to the incentives for modular homes, what would be in it for a local government to even want to provide those incentives? Because in some ways it sounds like their incentives are actually for, for the commercial property where they get the sales tax, et cetera, and some of the other zoning things you talked about. So why would they even want to provide those incentives?
I think it's just a question of values and what's important to that city. It may be the case that if you are building modular on a site that used to be retail, you're not going to get as much property tax revenue or sales tax revenue. But at the same time, we're facing a tremendous crisis, and I think you see some cities grappling with that question now. So related example, but here in Sacramento, the city has reduced impact fees for affordable housing. Now, they need those impact fees to pay for important infrastructure, but they've made a decision that affordable housing and getting that built in a manner that is cost-effective was more important.
I want to go back to the question I asked the professor, which he didn't answer, because of the exigencies of time. So I read over the weekend the special issue on housing in The Economist, and that was the motivation for my question. What I worry about is that we end up driving down a blind canyon of only California examples. And there's also a piece in Bloomberg Business Week this week about Microsoft's contribution for housing in Seattle. What I'm looking for is a menu of choices for us as we go forward. This is veering into like a business meeting, but if we spent all our time on AB 50, we wouldn't be adding a lot of value. The legislature knows that issue. The politics are reasonably straightforward. We wouldn't uncover any new facts. So one of our challenges is taking a look at things that have been tried elsewhere that might apply in California and tools. That's the only reason for going down the modular housing thing isn't because it's a good idea. It's just because it's a new idea. And so what I'm asking about is we've got $1 billion contributed by tech companies to the governor. I don't know how it's going to get used or what priority is going to be applied for that contribution. we have a real-world experiment in Seattle, and Singapore has a real-world experiment where they're building a particular kind of housing. I know the cultures are different, the government's different, and you don't have to answer it today, but if you could get back to the staff, it would be very helpful for each of you to give us some suggestions about topics where we could add value and dig deeper, as opposed to a better understanding of, slamming our hand into our forehead going, it's bad. Because the gap that you pointed to, at best, we're still behind creating the 180,000 new housing units to break even. And the housing units are, if we match the influx of high-income population, we're building housing units for people in the wrong part of the income spectrum. So you've got a lot of problems, and many of the solutions that are before the legislature are controversial and, frankly, aren't at scale. You've got 5 projects in San Francisco that have been approved in the last 5 years, and they aren't getting built because of environmental problems on former military bases. We're looking for suggestions about how to narrow down the scope of what we're looking at to 3 or 4 things that are practical. So if you could get back to the staff, that would be helpful.
So one thing I'll note quickly on that is that we recently did a report on best practices for land use reform, where we looked at what the state of Oregon has done, what the city of Denver, Portland, and Grand Rapids, Michigan have done. We talk a lot about single-family zoning. The city of Grand Rapids, Michigan eliminated single-family zoning in 2008 and has been a really leader on land use reform. So I'm happy to send that over to the staff if that's of interest to the commission.
Yep. Great, wonderful. I want to thank you both. This has been very illuminating. You can tell from the engagement by the commissioners. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Chairman, we'll ask Dan Dunmoyer, the President and CEO of the California Building Industry Association, to come up. And I think the staff will also switch to, he has a PowerPoint as well, which we will put up on the screen. And then after Dan's presentation and questions, we'll have the 2 representatives of local governments come up.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rarick. Commissioner, Mr. Chairman, commission members, Dan Dunmoyer with the California Building Industry Association. I too want to thank you for the opportunity to present our views on this issue and look forward to your questions. I'll answer a couple quick questions you've already asked. Commissioner Sidley asked if the numbers that the CURB report puts out on permits includes teardowns and rebuilds. It does. So the number this year you're going to see on permits pulled is about 110,000, so it's included within that number. The other question is, yes, we can sue when we disagree on the developer fee question, but the question was already answered. Since you have to do business with that city, you win the battle, but you lose the war. So thank you again for this opportunity. Quickly, who the CBI is. We represent about 85% of the builders, home building units that are built annually in California. That includes single-family homes and multifamily homes. Also, as pointed out by Director Garcia, we are now building about half single-family and half multifamily. It's the first time in the last 2 years. We've done that historically, as the Director noted. We have been primarily building single-family detached dwelling units. So that is changing in California, but just to kind of give you a perspective. My desire today is to try to illuminate some of the challenges. Since we got into universities, my training is at USC. You may find this interesting, but I agree with everything said by the colleagues from UCLA and those trained at Berkeley, so this may scare you, but very similar perspective here. You'll see from the building perspective, as you will from the professors that have spoken. So just looking, I'll quickly go through my slides because I really do wish to address this. I'll have to guess which way I go here. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all these slides. I'm going to focus on one component of the construction process. But we're oftentimes asked is, why does it cost so much to build in California? And why are you as builders not building housing that's affordable? Today I'll focus on housing that's affordable. Affordable housing is noted by the director and the professor effectively as a specifically legally defined concept. It's actually quite expensive to build affordable housing legally defined. So I'm going to focus on what we call market rate, what basically you would walk down the street and see KB homes or Lennar, the types of homes that a small builder would build, and just kind of walk through why it costs so much to build those kinds of homes. In this presentation, there are 4 different options to look at, kind of the basics. I'm going to focus on the last one, but just want to give you a sense of what our options are. Second, basic facets, as touched on again by the professor: land acquisition, planning, zoning entitlement, land development, horizontal construction. These are kind of the focal points. But I think one thing we just want to keep in mind is the consumer interest here. If you build something nobody wants to buy, even if you build it more affordably, it's not really a product that is useful. And I mention that because we spend a fortune asking customers what they want. And you would think we would do that as people who sell a product, but many times people will say, well, you should build smaller homes. And there is a market for that, but the market may not be sufficient to basically pay for the product. And so the consumer is still king here, or queen, and so they both can effectively determine what we do build, more so than even what some other body might suggest we build. The factors have been touched on. It's just kind of what we look at as home builders: acquisition costs, financing, CEQA, et cetera. I point all these out. I thought the professor did a great job of talking about the difference in the land price, so I won't drill on that too much, but I'll give you more specific. So the first example I want to give you is when people say, why didn't you build more affordably? And this project, this is a real project. There's only one here that's kind of, I can't list it because it's in the middle of negotiations, but this one here is a real project over in the Bay Area. Obviously a beautiful project. What I want to point out here is, as you can see from this project, you'll see that the eventual price point of this is affordable housing in the Bay Area, by the way, is defined at $1.16 million. But part of the dynamic of when you sit down with a city, this is a project, by the way, that started in 1989 and still hasn't been completed in sale. So in other words, it's been going on for quite a while. And so when you look at something, the goal here originally was to build 42 homes at $600,000. The builder here, in this case, Mr. Sanson, built 18 homes. And a lot of that has to do with the dynamics of local government, local control. As you can see, you could actually build homes on the opposite side of most of these streets. So if you look to the right-hand side, you have beautiful grassy knoll. That's where the 42 homes in total were supposed to go. Once you go through the planning process of 20 years, basically the neighbors that surround it, you can see all the neighbors around it, by the way, who are very, very much more densely populated, came to the city council and said, we don't want any homes here, period. That lasted for about 20 years, and eventually the answer was yes, but we only want 18 homes. So Mr. Sanson built those 18 homes, not the 42. Of course, when you have the same sewer, you have the same sewer that goes through the middle of that street, when you can't build the homes on the other side, you have to raise the price of that product. So instead of $600,000 or $700,000, it ended up at $1.16 million. So that's just a simple example of what happens when somebody says, well, just build 40, no, let's build 18. You still have the infrastructure prices, you still have the cost associated with that, and that drives the bottom line impact of what we sell the product for. Let me take you to another example here. This one's famous here. I sat on the PERS board for 4 years, so I know this one well, not because I'm part of CBIA. This is before my time at CBIA, but this is what we refer to as the pit down the street. This is a project that CalPERS invested with a local developer. And as you know, there's right now just pylons or cement pylons in there. Part of the reason why I bring this forward, a lot of the solution provider presented to us as members of the building committee is you should build up. And let's focus on transit-oriented districts, which, by the way, we do support. We support Senate Bill 50. So this is not to take away from that, but part of the challenge when you build up, as you'll see from the price point, this is a beautiful building, which still has not been built, is you look, even if you build homes that are only 500 square feet, which is relatively small, up to 2,000, if you want to get it so it prices out, you effectively are finding yourself at times as you go up, you're spending a lot more money in building costs. So let me put that into context. A single family stick home will cost as much as was 1/7 the cost of that same home on the 20th floor of a high-rise facility. Why is that? Because you have to have steel, cement, you have much more sophisticated labor. You have to pretty much pay prevailing wage because you're talking the best of the best builders. So nothing wrong with building tall buildings. It's just once you get past the 5th floor, you're paying 5x to 7x. So that's part of the challenge. If you keep it under 4 stories, you can get a price point that's more manageable. But on this one, you're effectively getting a place where, how many people in Sacramento can afford $1 million for a 2,000 square foot home when they can go 11 miles south of that building in this place called Elk Grove and buy the same home for half the price, 3 times bigger, especially on the 500 per square foot. That's 3 times bigger.
Can I ask you a question on that
Sure.
slide, just real quick? And it's an aside, and I apologize for raising an elephant in the room, but when I looked at this earlier, I saw in 4 of your expense buckets you list CEQA. What kind of impact does CEQA really I mean, it hasn't been discussed as in specifically as a development cost, but when you had the project that was 20 years, that's the first thing that came to my mind.
So let me go to that, and it's a great segue. So this is the one I'll drill down a little bit deeper on. It's development project number 4. It's located in Livermore, California. It took over 25 years to bring to conclusion. It's 475 units, 4 product lines, which means basically small to larger. So you've got attached, you've got individual single-family dwellings. It's a real project. Shea Homes, you can go out and visit it now, and I'm not marketing for any of our members, but you could buy a home there today if you wanted to. So here's the dynamic here, and I'll drill down a little bit more on this. And this is borne out exactly by the professor's comments as well. So if you look at this, I know it's in the fine print, but you have it in front of you. There's many different places where things like CEQA or reviews come into to play. So the hard permit cost, the $100,000, that 4th item there, is what you actually write a check for. So that check goes to the city of Livermore, and that's negotiated per project. And in this context, not only did they pay the permit fees, they built soccer fields, they built parks on top of paying the permit fees. And those permit fees include things like an art fee. They include things like pension abatement. They don't call it that. It's referred to as a community fee. But there's a whole host of things that you as a builder, even though we think the nexus to the actual public services needed is not accurate, we pay it. And part of that's because we are in a relationship with local governments. We want to get to yes. And so we do push back, but they control whether the project occurs. In each of those different areas, there's a bunch of soft costs. And you'll see that construction soft costs. You see that also entitlement costs. That's where something like CEQA will pop up. And the way CEQA is used, it's interesting because within the legislature, there are those who contend that CEQA has no impact on residential housing. And we would contend the opposite. Where it does, we're not opposed to CEQA. We live in California. We build in California. In Texas, when we work with them, they think CEQA is a bird. They don't know what we're talking about. But when we try to build in California, we understand we are a state committed to environmental excellence. So we're not fighting CEQA. Our challenge is how CEQA is used. It's not used to improve the environment. It's used as a weapon. And the way it's used as a weapon effectively is, one, if I don't want your project to exist, I'm just going to bring a CEQA lawsuit just to slow it down. And it's not, the environmental community, I'm not going to pick on them. It could be the neighboring developer who says, whoa, if we both try to bring, 200 homes at the same time, this is going to be good. I'm ahead of you, so I'm going to claim that you're going to impact transportation. Anytime you build a home, you will impact transportation. So, unless you don't have people driving, which you can build homes that don't have driving, don't have garages, but generally there's transportation impact, at least pedestrian transportation impact. So CEQA can be used by a developer, it can be used by labor, it can be used by neighbors, it can be used by somebody who lives in another state who knows how to play the game. We have people who live in Arizona who sue San Bernardino for CEQA impact. They don't even live in the community. And so this is just kind of the game. So our view on CEQA is keep CEQA, use it once, have all the parties that are involved, all parties involved, come forward and address the environmental impact. And then once that's mitigated, that could take 5 years, but once it's mitigated, then you build. But right now, we do it sequentially. So the neighbors bring a CEQA lawsuit, the developer brings a CEQA, these are all 3 years each. And then somebody else, the environmental community brings a lawsuit. And then somebody else from out of state brings a lawsuit. So you have a project like Saugus Newhall, which has been going on for 30 years, 31 CEQA lawsuits. New species have appeared since then. The kangaroo rat's gone, but the silver-tailed fox is present. So you get to a situation where you can delay a project for decades with the intent of addressing environmental concerns, but addressing them sequentially over and over again. And that's where, you look at the fee costs, which are profound. The fee costs in Texas, as a professor noted, are about $12,500 to $13,000. Here, the fee cost is $100,000. Well, what's hidden here in Texas, we build within 18 months, and in California, we build within 18 years or more. So the challenge for us as a building community is if I come to you and say, I have an investment opportunity My certainty of building is within 24 months has been 100% for the last 20 years. Will you invest with me? And the answer is yes. If I come to you saying, I have an investment opportunity, the certainty of building is not certain. It will take at least 20 years. I don't know if I'll have a return, and my track record is 50-50. You may invest with me, but your cost of money is going to be geometrically, if not astronomically higher.
Yeah, and that's and I'll get to you, Commissioner Barr. But that was it. Just struck me as a developer, what are the financial costs associated to financing a project like this? And so you got to buy the land, right? And you've got to become involved and engaged. What are the financial impacts on investors when you're looking at what you said, 18 years as compared to 18 weeks?
So they are profound. I mean, what's happened in California since the Great Recession is 2/3 of the building community never came back. And that's driven a lot of the issues. Also in California, as compared to other states, we primarily have publicly owned companies who build. They're the only ones who can sustain that time frame. Where in other states, I was just in a meeting with my counterparts across the country, they have, state of Virginia has 3 times as many builders as the state of California does, because any of us around this table with $50,000 could go build a home. You can't do that in California. So, my dad was a small-time builder in Hemet, and his house, from start to finish was 18 months. If he had to wait 18 years, well, I wouldn't have been able to have clothes on my back. So that's the dynamic that's different. And so it does drive up the cost. We have to go to more high-risk investors. We have to go to China. We go to Europe. In Canada, we have to go to people, this sounds bad, so we have to go to people who don't fully comprehend California, because if they did, they probably would charge even more. So, I mean, it's one of those things like, California, it's a beautiful state. Everybody wants to go there. This must be a great investment. And then they find out 15 years later, they're still holding on to it. I mean, they get very sophisticated quickly. The Chinese are brilliant people, so they charge more for it. And so that's part of our challenge, is just how can we more affordably deliver the project. I'll conclude with these comments, realizing of my limitation on time. It really is two simple statements which have stunning political overturns, but the policy statements are simple. If we can build more quickly with less fees and regulations, that's how we can deliver housing that's more affordable. And it's a true statement, has a lot of complications, which are noted, Prop 13, issues of local control, issues of neighbors who don't want more neighbors. But those are the 2 basic components. They have a lot of different components within them. But to prove my point, and this is to your point, Commissioner, the reason why other states build more quickly and more easily is they have found other means of financing their schools other than through fees, other means of financing their infrastructure other than through fees. And as a result of that, 82 miles east of here in Reno, we're building at almost 1/3 the cost of what it takes to build in the coastal areas in California. And as the professor mentioned, you're talking 8x between Santa Monica and San Bernardino. We say for every mile east of Santa Monica, the price of the home goes down $19,000. So once you get to San Bernardino, it becomes affordable. So those are some of the components. But we do build these housing units that are more affordable in Arizona, in Oregon, Nevada, Texas. And because of those 2 factors, we can build more predictably, more quickly, with lower fees and less regulation. Let me conclude there and answer any questions you may have.
Commissioner Barr?
Thank you for your testimony. I have conflicting feelings about home builders because my brother-in-law is a home builder, but I like him. Just kidding. So I'm reading, while you're testifying, a report out today from the Brookings Institute, which is not a bastion of conservative thinking. And they tee up the political argument as the YIMBY crowd, yes, in my backyard, thinks that land use limitations are driving up housing costs. The sort of left or the progressive folks, it's all greedy home builders and real estate developers. That's obviously a caricature. But later in the same article, and this is a quote, "The process of building new homes is full of uncertainty and unexpected obstacles. Regulatory barriers make it riskier, longer, and more expensive, which has consequences for housing affordability." You just gave us testimony that gave the details about that and the differential effect in California. I'm not suggesting we don't go down a CEQA reform thing, but the fundamental point that you're making is one that we need to underline time and again, which is a risky proposition drives up the cost of capital, and delay creates the time value of money calculation. And so I know from the industry that I came from, which was the pharmaceutical industry, half of the overall cost of developing a new drug was the time value of money, because it took 15 years. So you can see that there are consequences to each nick along the way, regardless of the source or the intention. And the challenge is that no one is really looking at it in a holistic way, even though it's a societal imperative to develop new housing and making it affordable across a number of policy dimensions. But the people who are implementing it are not recognizing the uncertainty and delay problems. And do you have a suggestion of a grand bargain that would facilitate a conversation that addresses the problem you laid out?
Well, I do applaud the governor. I think the term, the Marshall Plan, so I hadn't really looked at the Marshall Plan for a while, so I went back and studied my history books. And the Marshall Plan is a right answer. The governor is right to use that as his analogy. It was a need to build a lot quickly. They brought together all the disparate parties, they reduced the regulations, and they attracted the capital. So that's kind of, the governor's laid a framework of concept that is spot on. So to the various parties, it's labor, it's local government, it's trial lawyers who sue us more in California than any other state. It's the whole issues of the environmental community. It is where can we agree we want to build? Where can we agree how we want to build? And what can we do to help the cities pay for what we want to build, and do so in a comprehensive fashion? I do respect the challenges of local government. Right now they have the incentive to build, as was pointed out, large box facilities as opposed to homes. And if you go to split roll, I won't make a comment on pro or against it. Split roll just incentivizes more so the building of commercial versus residential, because you can price it more accurately or more frequently, whatever term you want to use. If you're a proponent or opponent, forget about that. It just means that your incentive as local government will be, well, if I build a big box, not only do I get more money and sales tax, I can, if it goes up in value, I can recognize it immediately. Where this home, if a little old lady stays in there for 40 years, I can't. So we do have to look at the tax structure, but to me it is bringing all those parties together. I ran into Richard Katz, a former legislator here. He said, in the old days, Dan, we just all sit in a room and beat you up until you got what we wanted. And frankly, that's probably what needs to happen. Not to beat us up, but bring us in a room and get us to consensus. And so I do think that is the solution, because everyone does have a good argument, but the challenge is until we all come together and provide a good solution, we're not going to address this crisis.
Any other questions from commissioners? Seeing none. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Next panel.
And now, Mr. Chairman, we'll ask both Sean McGlynn, who is the city manager of the city of Santa Rosa, and Christopher Lee, who is the legislative representative for housing, land use, and transportation for the California State Association of Counties, to come up. They both have brief comments, and then commissioners can have questions. So I think we'll start with Mr. McGlynn.
Welcome.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the factors driving housing costs in the state. The cost of housing in California is a complex system consisting of many levers that get pulled by different sectors, as you heard, to produce housing. This includes all levels of government, builders, and developers. However, cities throughout the state are committed to finding a solution and are already implementing strategies, and I think that's why we were asked to come forward, because the recognition the governors gave us on several times, and actually folks like Beacon Economics, Mr. Thornburg has recognized the work we're doing as a city. So I'm going to cut right to there. Like many cities in California, Santa Rosa has been facing a protracted housing crisis due to a lack of supply, low production, and increased prices. In addition, in 2017, Santa Rosa was devastated by a wildfire that destroyed 5% of our housing stocks, 3,000 homes overnight. We've made significant strides in that recovery process. About 2,000 of those homes are in the either rebuilt or in the final part of that process. We're still working on 1,000 homeowners as they try to figure out how to become the individual developer we've asked them to become in this process. But we still had those other factors prior to and have only gotten exacerbated by that work. And one of those is, I'm just going to cite example, the teachers in our community. A large percentage of that workforce is nearing retirement. Attracting and retaining new teachers is essential. According to the Santa Rosa City School District, a response that is often heard after offering employment is that the candidate cannot afford to live in the community. The current budget situation of California education creates a gap of approximately 50% between beginning teacher salary and the cost of purchasing a median-priced home in Santa Rosa. If the current conditions prevail, Santa Rosa City Schools will be left with a shortage of teachers, especially in the high-needs area of math, science, and special education. In the face of these challenges, the Santa Rosa City Council over multiple election cycles has made housing a top priority, giving staff, housing partners, and the community at large a clear message on where the city was going to focus its resources and accept the risks associated with those focus. As you heard, traditionally we've relied on things like impact fees to get services and to produce and maintain our infrastructure. In response, city staff has brought together a number of aggressive housing policies that addressed time, certainty, and the cost of housing production. All received unanimous political support. A majority of these policies were focused on downtown and transit-oriented development. So I'm going to go through the top 10 things that we've done as a community. The elimination of impact and utility fees for ADUs 750 square feet or less. That resulted in what was 5 applications a year. In the last 2 years, over 100 applications each year, and was the model program for the state's ADU policy. Reduction of the inclusionary housing requirement to encourage more units to be built on site versus paying a fee, which was an escape clause that some developers were really ready to take us up on. Reduction of reduced discretionary action for design review and use permit process for housing projects in the downtown or near TDA. Implemented a downtown high-density residential incentive program. So we capped impact fees at 3 stories. As you heard, the taller you go, the more expensive a project comes. Deferred water and sewer fees. And we entered into a unique partnership with the school district to reduce their impact fees, which again is a risk for the school district as we've been talking about Prop 13 and other impact fees. We updated the city's downtown specific plan to provide clear pathway for development, including CEQA exemptions for projects consistent with the plan, moving to a vehicle miles traveled approach, elimination of parking requirements. They're still getting parking requirements from their lenders. So we've cleared the path, but as has been brought up, the financing won't come unless they can provide the parking, which is, again, that's someplace we don't have a role in, and they're forced to figure that out by the financial institutions. And an elimination of height gaps in favor of floor area ratio approach. Create an express permitting process for downtown infill, taking an 18-month process down to 6 months or less. Approved a local density bonus up to 100% in the downtown and near transit. Created a renewal enterprise district, the first of its kind in the state with the County of Sonoma, enabling a regional approach to funding housing projects. And with that group, we're pursuing the tax increment financing in coordination with the county. Recent legislation has made that reality even more possible than before. And we're working with the private sector, a newly created employer housing council, to identify from businesses and large employers ways to help finance projects and get them over the finish line. So we've stepped up and tried to relieve a lot of the things that you've heard, but we still have a problem. There still remains a gap in these projects. And one of the things that hasn't been discussed is that we're part of the Bay Area economic environment. So actually, the cost of land is relatively cheap in the Bay Area, in our area, but the cost to construct is the same price as the South Bay as it is up in Santa Rosa. So it creates a different environment on our level where there's significant gapping in that financing. So what we need is some way to help catalyze those developers that are out there. And we're seeing a large increase in interest in Santa Rosa in response to these changes, but there still remains this significant gap. So while planning money is still needed, we need catalyst money similar to what's going on the homeless side with HEAP to help get these projects over the finish line, because we're taking a huge risk. We would love to see the state join us in that risk and help catalyze some of these projects.
Commissioner Sidley has a question, comment.
Yeah.
Where are the, where's your workforce living? You have all this construction work. Those people are as challenged as a teacher. So where are they living?
Well, we're relatively lucky in the Sonoma County. We have a lot of employment base in it, but as that employment ages out and some of the issues that we're facing, we're starting to see that leaching happening. The power safety shutoffs and repeated fires have taken a toll economically and psychologically on the community moving forward. But right now, we're one of those counties where actually we support ourselves in a lot of ways. Where we are seeing some transit happen, and you hear that, it's going to be in the future as those folks can't live. And so where they're choosing to live is further inland, and that's a long commute, as much as 2 hours.
Right. I think, so I understand that, but I guess my more specific question, and maybe Dan has some thoughts on this as well, is the construction workers, the guys who are building these houses, what are they doing?
They tend to be local. That's what I'm trying
really?
to say.
Oh,
so,
okay.
So we're that's the challenge we get into, is that when we get across, when we take these things on the macro scale, we miss some of the microeconomics. That's why I'm bringing up, we're slightly different than the other areas in the Bay. You'll hear from my colleagues in other areas of the Bay that there's this huge incentive to build more Class A office space, and that's what they're battling, because that's where the dollars are. That's where the developers can make the most impact and increase their bottom line. It isn't in housing, right? And so you got areas like Mountain View and Palo Alto where they're trying to actually limit the amount of Class A office space that's getting built, because that's where the market wants the developers to go.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I have a question, just a clarification. You made a reference to something about impact fees above the third floor. Did I hear that right? So,
Yes.
And I asked that because I was specifically asked by a member on the floor when I was circulating that he's thinking about doing something like that in his community. So what did you do?
So we basically said after the third floor, we're reducing those fees to
Okay.
essentially nothing.
All right, I'll send him to you.
Okay,
Because
absolutely.
he's thinking about that. And if you've already done it, it might be a great model.
And we just did it. Yep.
Thanks.
So talking, it kind of dovetails with the question I asked earlier. So you're reducing fees, eliminating fees. What is that doing to the cash flow for the city? Are you having to make that up in other ways, or do the benefits of the housing make that up for you? I mean, how do you
So that's
balance
the grand question. I mean, that's the risk, right? I think it was Professor Garcia that said philosophically you have communities that are stepping into that fray and are willing to take that risk. The unknown we have is what is going to be the long-term ramification of making that choice. Right now, we know that if we don't get the housing, the case study on the teachers is only going to be across the board. We're seeing that in all of our, not just on the affordable side, but also any of that so-called workforce housing. There's real pressures on our employers to provide that. That's why they're entering into agreements with developers to actually reserve housing for their employees and projects that are underway, so they become part of the financing mechanism to get that project to the finish line.
Just two quick fact questions. Santa Rosa's opportunity zone under the tax.
We have two, one in our downtown and one in an area of the community that's called Roseland. Yeah.
Okay, so opportunity zones were sold as a economic development opportunity. Has it worked yet for Santa Rosa?
I think, one of the challenges with opportunity zones is you're trying to get folks to invest in areas where they have traditionally been reluctant to invest, and so there's a
Well, it's a sweet deal for the people with a lot of money.
But it's a long-term game, and some of the issues we're talking about right now are some of the issues that can impact. Is the next election cycle going to change how I'm faring in a long-term investment strategy? So we're working on it, but I can't say that we have a definitive answer. I think in our downtown core, because in point of fact, that's an interesting part for us, is our downtown core is part of that. That's where there might be some success around opportunity zone.
The second question is unrelated. In the background material from the staff, the observation was made that some smaller jurisdictions have challenges with larger developments in terms of staffing. And so one idea would be to create a task force SWAT team at the state level to help smaller jurisdictions replicate the kind of innovative things that you're doing. Would that work for other places, counties that are not as big or cities that are not as sophisticated?
We've recommended that not only in this type of environment, but actually in disaster recovery. Is we had some success, and frankly, the reason we were able to bank on that success is we were able to invest, because we still had reserves to do it, invest in a firm to come in to run essentially its own standalone permitting center for recovery. And we've told the state, you're going to need to think about those types of solution sets where you can help smaller communities manage the burden that is going to come with this, because just doing it by fiat isn't going to create staff capacity.
You could do it like HCD. You could have a SWAT team, whatever you want to call it. You could do something like with at Housing and Community Development, where you had like a SWAT team, whatever, or just technical assistance team, whatever you want to call it, to say, the disaster hits and that team shows up in your community the next day, just like FEMA shows up to do whatever they do.
Or provide funding for them to actually hire the consultants to help stretch their capacity as they're going through those types of situations.
I mean, the question is, and I don't have a clue what HCD does for a living, so I don't know.
There's Commissioner Schomburger, and then we'll hear from Mr. Lee.
So to what extent, I live in a small town, not too far from Santa Rosa, actually. So to what extent do you think local government leaders are under pressure from constituents in the town to actually stop or prevent housing developments? In my town, it feels like that pressure is there from some folks. And is there anything that can be done at the state level, and maybe it goes to something Dan said, to give local leaders some cover to do maybe what they would like to do, but they're having a hard time doing it?
Let me drop this in there. I was asked at one point when I was in the legislature by people in my district if they could count their maids' quarters towards housing. That might give you some insight as to the kind of resistance you get.
Yes. Yeah.
I think we all know that there's resistance out there. I think, it's going to be how the community approaches it, and some of it's going to be education. Again, doing things by fiat doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get done, and there can be other ramifications to those conversations. I just think you're going to be better off if you're incentivizing work and creating a proactive way for communities to engage and rewarding that behavior to communities that make those types of investments, because local politics can get very squirrely very quickly. And even with rules and regulations, doing a lot of work in disaster recovery, regulators find a hard time doing enforcement. That's all I will say.
Thank you. Mr. Lee, we'll hear from the counties.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the Commission. My name is Chris Lee. I'm the Legislative Representative for Housing, Land Use, and Transportation for CSAC. I assume many of you are familiar with CSAC, but for those of you who are not, we're a voluntary association of California's 58 counties. We're proud to have all of them as members, and our job is representing the county voice before the California legislature and administration, as well as at the federal level. And so I always like to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about what counties are and what they do, and I think it's especially interesting in the context of housing, because We represent in the unincorporated areas just over 16% of the state's population. It's about 6.6 million people. And counties have all the same responsibilities that cities do related to adopting a housing element, approving development, having a general plan in the unincorporated area. But we aren't always given the same tools and opportunities to expedite housing and things of that nature that cities often enjoy within their boundaries. In addition to that direct sort of municipal services and land use role, we also have oversight for a broad array of countywide services ranging from health and human services to public safety, prosecution, defense, probation, agricultural weights and measures, a whole suite of things. And I think partially, most notably because of our health and human services responsibilities, we do have a little bit different of a lens on the housing crisis and what priorities might be in terms of addressing it. So many of the folks that are served by counties programs are eligible for housing assistance. We're talking about the very difficult problem of how do we bring online below market rate homes? How do we provide for the subsidy? How do we provide for the infrastructure? And then how do we look for folks experiencing homelessness or substance use disorders or mental illness? Not only just the physical infrastructure of building the housing, which is very costly, as we've been discussing this morning, but also for providing the ongoing wraparound services that clients in those facilities need. So we have both all the same problems that the cities have, and then this whole other suite of problems related to health and human services issues.
I'm sorry, I just have to say this, and I know it's just on the top of my mind, but are you talking about things like 1991 realignment?
Yeah, and I understand from your, in the state of California, we are, I don't know about unique, but exceptional in the degree to which a lot of programs that are statewide programs are managed at the local level. So CalWorks, all of the health and human services programs related to indigent health, behavioral health, substance use disorders, those are administered at the county level. And as we're seeing this awful trend in homelessness, I think there's a lot of discussion between cities and counties about whose role is what and how can we work together to tackle this problem, which really does relate directly to the broader affordability issues.
What you just said sort of like rang a bell. Did I see a couple of weeks ago the city of Santa Ana suing neighboring cities because they weren't doing their share with respect to the homeless population? Does that sound familiar?
I'm not aware of that, but I can say in the city of Santa Rosa, we wouldn't be taking such an approach. These are larger issues, right, and we try to figure out how we work with our colleagues. And to the point here is that now cities find themselves in these conversations where traditionally they haven't, and investing substantial resource to try to make impacts, because we know that the counties are challenged with a lot of their resource allocation and how to do it as well. We're part of that solution set.
Yeah, question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mr. McGlynn, a question of you. I live in the community of Redlands, California, and in the late 70s, after Petaluma introduced their restrictive development plan, we I think, put in a more restrictive plan in terms of the fact that you can't build up more than so many floors. And so do you have a total limitation? I say, and you're going from third floor above, reducing fees. Do you have a total limitation?
We're working on a sort of density equation to help. We have historic districts that ring the downtown core, so that there's a stepping up process. But right now, we're not setting a maximum limit. So again, gone are the days where we're going to prescribe to the developer community what their business is and how they're going to get the job done. We're going to try to create opportunity in the city of Santa Rosa for that investment to happen within some clear guidelines, so that we can protect those historic neighborhoods that are concerned about the direct impact of density, but still recognize where we are and where we want to go as a community in the downtown.
So we're in the process of having an extension on the MetroLink, which is a regional train system, And we're looking at the issue of transit villages, which has become very controversial because they wanted to have an increased height of buildings around there. So I was just wondering if you'd had some situations with
and again, we'd be happy to share that with whoever would want to, but that's where we've settled, and it's been a community engagement process to talk to those neighbors and really understand where we want to go as a community.
Yeah, we always run into that thing where we don't want the orange groves to be taken out to build houses, but nobody wants to build up a little bit. So we have a bit of the hypocrisy there.
So, Mr. Lee, I think I interrupted you.
Oh, no worries. So I'll continue. I just wanted to have that broader comment about we not only have this direct land use authority, but we also have the broad suite of services that in many ways are tied into homelessness and some of the affordability issues that we're seeing in our communities. Just to touch on some comments that I heard earlier in the day, talking about by right zoning and approval processes and things like that. And I really do want to tout funding from SB2, which is the document recording fee tax that was passed several years ago, is on its way out the door. And the first year of that funding was split between homelessness work and between planning grants for local communities. And so California requires a lot of local agencies. I see in bills that I work on every day, there will be no reimbursement because you are able to recoup these costs through fees. You know, ostensibly you can, sometimes you might not. But we are providing a huge $125 million investment in planning, and every jurisdiction statewide is eligible. I just got a status report last week. I think we're going to have every county except for Lassen, Modoc, and potentially Mendocino has already submitted an application for that. And the requirements of the grant program are such that things such as creating an ordinance where you allow for by right approval of housing, so you get out of complicated CEQA processes, you get out of a lot of controversial hearings, and you allow developers to go much more quickly into construction, that's an eligible expense. So Alpine County applied for a grant and is going to have by right elements in their upcoming housing element update. So I think to the extent that the state wants to invest in these sort of activities and really narrowly define what's eligible to these things that we all agree are helpful in expediting production, that's a great approach, and I think we're going to see huge dividends from SB2, especially as folks go into the next housing element cycle. We did have a lot of discussion about CEQA. I mentioned earlier that counties often have difficulty with CEQA. We are often the areas that are more new growth, greenfield. There was a discussion about moving from a level of service metric for transportation to this new VMT, vehicle miles traveled metric for transportation. And I think folks in the unincorporated area are starting to realize that projects that previously wouldn't have had a transportation impact, even small development projects in more rural contexts, are now going to be forced into statements of overriding consideration and going through full EIR. So we're in this process, I would say, at the state level where we really want to hammer on local jurisdictions to help bring housing online, but counties especially are in a tough spot in between these sort of competing dynamics of we want to grow inward, we want to grow within existing communities. We've traditionally gotten exceptionally high allocations for regional housing needs planning. If you looked at earlier cycles of the housing element, we got disproportionately high numbers. We're seeing that kind of change a little bit as SB 375 sustainable community strategies are kind of implemented around the state. But we are caught in this tough spot of, you know, please grow, meet your regional housing needs assessment targets. If not, we may withhold funding for you, but also not creating a regulatory environment that's necessarily favorable for the type of housing that can come online in unincorporated areas.
That's a really interesting concept. I know down south, I think we just went through this regional housing needs assessment, and they did had a very high allocation to the rural areas, and it was disproportionate to infrastructure needs and as well as where the jobs are. So it kind of goes back to that. Is that, but you're seeing a consistent, now a consistent rethinking of the regional housing needs in rural areas?
Yes, and AB 101 creates a process where HCD and OPR and stakeholders are going to get together between now and 2023 and propose some changes to the regional housing needs allocation process. But what I hear from planners and supervisors is, you look at counties where we're approaching a very important implementation date for the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We have real resource constraints that affect the ability to bring housing online. And so I think the tough work in that AB 101 implementation discussion is going to be, how do we align all these competing directives, and what does that mean for where we build housing? I mentioned before the CEQA streamlining, and we were able to work with Assemblymember Berman a couple years ago to pass a bill that took away one of my favorite talking points, which is we don't get the same infill streamlining for CEQA that cities do. Well, we were able to get some additional streamlining in place that should allow, in the more dense, more urban parts of the unincorporated area, some additional level of certainty. And I think as we see people rezoning in this upcoming housing element, we'll really be able to look at some of those opportunities there as well. But as you mentioned, the infrastructure limitations are serious in a lot of our unincorporated communities. And what we've been pushing for, the funding allocation in the budget last year, there's a $90 million set aside that's over the counter for smaller jurisdictions, which could be small rural cities. It could be unincorporated areas that are more rural. But we really want to move towards a model of the county's planning for housing here. We're hopefully doing it in an existing community, in an infill context. Can we take some risk and do the infrastructure improvements up front, similar to what Santa Rosa was talking about, and then provide a by right process for approval, right? Because a lot of the funding right now is limited to, do you have an application? Is there a developer that's interested in building in this spot? And so you have a chicken and egg issue in some of our rural communities, especially those that really want to, bring workforce housing online. It's especially acute in some of our areas where we have a lot of a tourist workforce or national parks. The counties that I've heard really talking about this are not the ones you'd necessarily expect. So I think kind of aligning those investments with the plans and then aligning all the competing directives that come from the state into RENA is important work, and I hope that the AB 101 implementation will provide an opportunity for that.
I had heard that OPR was looking again at VMT and how it's being applied. Have you heard that as well?
I think we're really early in, I believe the final regulations required statewide implementation starting in, it's either 2020 or 21, I should know that. But there are several jurisdictions, mostly more urban jurisdictions, that had voluntarily done it several years ago. I think what we're going to start to see is, what does it look like in less urban contexts? And the concerns that we had raised very early in the process were about the applicability to land use projects, especially in more rural jurisdictions. So, and the issue there is, of course, it's hard to feasibly mitigate a vehicle mile traveled. Like, I can charge you a transit
Port of Los
fee.
Angeles.
Yeah,
I get it.
Yeah.
So, and trucks, are part of that too. So, but I did understand that OPR was going to take another look. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments by commissioners? I want to thank both of you. As you can tell from having been here all day, what I think is a little different about our process is, we took like 2.5, 3 hours, whereas oftentimes if you find yourselves before a legislative committee, you get 3 minutes. And I also want to extend my compliments to the staff for the background briefing paper that was done that provided the foundation for us to prepare for this hearing. And as Commissioner Byer mentioned and raised, I think the contribution that Little Hoover can make is searching for a series of recommendations that and policy considerations that are not political. Sometimes people are happy when we do that, and other times they're not. But quite frankly, our responsibility is to try to sift through the information that we get and make decisions that we think are in the best interest of all Californians and the various stakeholders that are involved. And I would just want to extend our appreciation. Thank you so much for just giving us better insight as to the sort of challenges that counties have that are different than other entities. And, thank you to Santa Rosa for, you've got a community that has reacted differently from others in terms of recognizing the significance and the consequences of the housing issue. There are probably people where I live that aren't very happy with some of the things that I say, because I live in Santa Barbara, and for the longest time, we've done everything we could to prevent anybody from building anything. I was at a function in Fresno one time, and a builder came up and he said, I used to try to build in Santa Barbara, and I had to move here. But I do think that as we begin to more accurately identify all of the consequences, so it isn't just about the housing, it is about the financial impacts on all of the rest of it. So that if your first responders are impacted, if your teachers are impacted, if you're looking at sort of chicken and egg thing, as we were talking about the value of amenities, people look to a community because of the schools in large part. And if we're not smart about what we are doing, we're going to hobble our schools by creating a deficit of competent teachers that can afford to live in the communities where they are providing the services that we all say are critically important. So I think part of what we can do that I don't know necessarily has been emphasized enough are the downstream consequences of not having appropriate and affordable housing for people in our state. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, we should adjourn the public hearing and then reconvene in a business meeting in room 125.
That's why Mr. Rarick is so valuable to the commission, because it reminds me when I forget what I'm supposed to do.